They say the dead leave this world when they're buried. That's a lie. The dead leave when no one remembers their name. I learned that lesson kneeling in a forgotten cemetery, pressed against a grave that shouldn't have existed, listening to something breathe just beneath the soil. I started going to the cemetery because it was the only place where my body felt quieter. The pain didn't disappear, but it softened, like it was being absorbed by the ground. The place sat beyond the tree line at the edge of town, old and neglected, with headstones leaning like tired men, and patches of earth where markers had long since vanished. I always went to the same spot. No name, no dates, just a flat stone swallowed by grass. That was where Evan was buried, my best friend. Officially, he was never there. His family paid for silence instead of a service, erasure instead of grief. I brought flowers anyway, kneeling until my joints screamed, whispering his name like a prayer the earth wasn't supposed to hear. The longer I stayed, the weaker I felt. It wasn't sudden, just a slow, creeping heaviness like the air itself was thickening around me. Sometimes the wind circled that stone and nowhere else, lifting the petals and spinning them in place. I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself a lot of things. Mostly, I told myself that remembering him was the least I could do. If I couldn't save Evan when he was alive, I could at least refuse to forget him now. The day everything changed, I must have fallen asleep beside the grave. My illness made exhaustion unpredictable, like someone flipping a switch inside me. When I woke, my cheek was pressed to cold stone, my limbs numb, my mouth dry. I tried to push myself up and couldn't. That's when I heard it soft, almost kind, spoken just above my ear. A woman's voice, smooth as damp moss. She asked if I was awake. I remember staring at the hem of a green dress, at bare feet sunk slightly into the soil, and realizing with quiet horror that the cemetery had gone completely still. I don't know how long she stood there before I found the strength to lift my head. Her hair hung forward, hiding her face, moving even though the air no longer stirred. When I asked what she wanted, she laughed, not cruelly, but patiently, like I'd asked the wrong question. She told me the dead don't rest when they're forgotten. They linger. They wait. Then she said something I didn't understand until much later, that only two people still remembered him, and that memory was never free. As she stepped back and faded into the gray afternoon, the ground beneath Evan's grave felt warm. And somewhere deep below it, something shifted, as if it had just heard its name spoken aloud. I don't remember standing up, but suddenly she was closer, and I was upright, swaying, my knees trembling like they might fold backward. The woman's dress was the color of wet moss clinging to stone, heavy and old-fashioned, the kind you'd see in faded photographs tucked into history books. She was barefoot, her feet half sunken into the soil, as if the ground had already accepted her. Her hair hung forward in long dark strands, hiding her face completely, yet I knew without seeing that her eyes were fixed on me. The air around her smelled wrong, like damp earth left too long in the dark. When she spoke again, her voice wasn't cruel. That was the worst part. It was gentle, almost fond, as if she were explaining something inevitable, something that had already been decided long before I was born. She told me the dead don't leave when their bodies fail. They linger when they're forgotten. Names, she said, are anchors, and without them souls drift, unraveling slowly, painfully. Someone must remember them, she explained, or they become bound to the places where memory last touched them. Cemeteries, hospitals, bedrooms where the air still smells like the person who's gone. My stomach twisted as her words sank in. Evan wasn't resting beneath that stone. He was trapped, held there by neglect and silence, by a world that decided it was easier to erase him than to mourn him. I opened my mouth to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the truth had already settled into my bones. I'd felt it every time the ground seemed to breeze beneath me. That's when she told me I was one of two, one of only two people still capable of remembering him. The words struck harder than any diagnosis I'd ever received. I wanted to ask who the other one was, but fear sealed my throat. The woman shifted slightly, and for a moment her hair parted just enough for me to see a sliver of gray skin beneath, cracked, uneven, not quite human. She leaned closer, and the air grew colder. Then she gave me the warning, her voice lowering, as if the cemetery itself were listening. If I taught others to remember, she said, I would forget. Memory was not infinite. It had weight, and once it was shared, it could be taken from me entirely. I felt something inside my head recoil, as though my mind itself understood the threat before I did. I tried to step back, but my legs failed me. The edges of the world blurred, and a low fog began to creep across the ground, rolling in thick waves between the graves. The woman straightened, retreating without turning, her feet never lifting from the earth, simply dissolving into the mist as if she'd never been there at all. No footprints, no sound, just absence. I collapsed beside the stone, my hands clawing at grass slick with dew, lungs burning as the fog closed in. The last thing I remember before everything went gray was the certainty that something had changed forever, that by remembering Evan, I had already agreed to a bargain I didn't understand, with a woman who had forgotten her own name long before she ever learned mine. I don't know how long I lay there, pressed to the ground, choking on fog that smelled faintly of rot and metal. When I finally forced my eyes open, the cemetery looked wrong. The stones seemed farther apart, stretched as if the space between them had been pulled thin. Then I saw him standing near the unmarked grave. Evan, or something shaped like him. At first I felt a surge of relief so sharp it hurt. He was upright, facing me, wearing the clothes I remembered him in best. But the longer I stared, the more the details slipped. His shoulders sagged unnaturally, one arm hanging lower than the other. His face looked unfinished, like a sketch erased and redrawn too many times. When he took a step toward me, his knee bent the wrong way, and his body folded inward, collapsing like wet paper before shuddering and forcing itself upright again. I whispered his name, but he didn't respond the way Evan would have. His mouth moved slowly, stretching wider than it should, and he spoke in a flat, distant voice. Beyond this place, there is only haze. He said it once, then again, and again. I backed away, my heart slamming against my ribs, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't steady myself. Each time I blinked, he seemed less solid, pieces of him blurring at the edges, as if the fog were actively erasing him. When he reached out, his fingers fused together, separating and rejoining in a way that made bile rise in my throat. Beyond this place, there is only haze, he repeated, his voice growing louder, overlapping with itself. The ground beneath my feet vibrated, and yellow-green mist began pouring from the soil, thick and acrid, stinging my eyes and lungs. I turned and ran. I don't remember choosing a direction, only the instinct to escape. The fog chased me, curling around my ankles, breathing hot against the back of my neck. I heard something behind me fall apart with a wet sound, like a body hitting mud, followed by a distorted scream that might have been my own. I burst out of the cemetery onto the road, coughing so hard I thought my chest would split open. A car horn blared as headlights bore down on me, blinding and close. I stumbled backward, barely avoiding the rush of air as a truck screamed past. My legs gave out and I collapsed on the shoulder, gagging as the sulfur smell clung to my clothes and hair. When the fog finally thinned, the world snapped back into place too quickly, like someone had slammed reality into focus. Later, under fluorescent lights, a doctor told me calmly that stress and illness can cause vivid hallucinations. He suggested rest, medication adjustments, grounding exercises. I nodded and agreed because that's what people do when the explanation is easier than the truth. But hallucinations don't leave footprints in your memory that burn. They don't smell like decay, and they don't repeat the same sentence with the weight of a warning. I was still shaking when I stepped outside the clinic, the evening air cold and sharp in my lungs. Traffic moved normally now, indifferent and loud. Across the street, near the bus stop, a woman stood watching me, barefoot, wrapped in a moss-colored dress that brushed the pavement without touching it. Her hair hung forward, hiding her face, but I didn't need to see it to know who she was. The moss woman tilted her head slightly, as if assessing whether I'd understood the lesson. Then she stepped backward and vanished. No sound, no trace, just the certainty that Evan hadn't come to me to comfort me. He had come to show me what happens to the forgotten, and that whatever was coming next was already following me home. The nights after that were the worst. Sleep brought Evan back, not as the thing I'd seen in the cemetery, but as he was in the hospital during those last months. The room was always the same in my dreams. White walls, humming machines, curtains that never quite closed all the way. His family had stopped coming by then. They said it was prayer. That distance was meant to heal something shameful they refused to name. I never believed that. I only knew they stopped answering calls, stopped signing in at the front desk, stopped saying his name. Lena and I were the only ones who kept showing up, sitting on opposite sides of his bed, pretending that laughter could outrun a prognosis. Evan joked less as time went on, but he still smiled for us, like he didn't want to be the reason we broke. One afternoon, while Lena went to get coffee, Evan grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. His eyes were wide, darting to the corners of the room. He asked me if I could feel it too, the way the walls were pulling back, like they were making space for something else. He said they were forgetting him. I laughed it off at first, told him he was tired, that hospitals mess with your head. But then he screamed, not in pain panic. "I'm not a memory," he shouted, over and over, until nurses rushed in and I was pushed out into the hall. I slid down the wall and cried into my hands, convinced I'd failed him by not listening. That was the first time I felt truly afraid of surviving him. Now, remembering that day, something clicks into place that makes my stomach turn. In the reflection of the hospital window, behind Evan's bed, I remember seeing a smear of green that didn't belong there. A shape that didn't move when people walked past. At the time, I thought it was exhaustion, a trick of light. But now I know better. She was there, watching him realize what was happening, watching me dismiss it. The moss woman didn't come into my life at the cemetery. She'd been circling it long before, waiting for the moment memory started to slip. Evan knew before any of us did. He felt himself unraveling while I was still planning a future that didn't include him. That's the part no one talks about when they tell survival stories. Living isn't clean. It's heavy. Every breath I took after Evan died felt borrowed, like I was carrying something that didn't belong to me. I lived long enough to leave the hospital behind, long enough to build a life, long enough to forget the smell of antiseptic on my hands, and Evan didn't. Somewhere between those two truths, guilt took root. The moss woman didn't need to explain that part to me. She only had to show me that memory and survival are tangled together, that sometimes the price of living is carrying the dead with you, even when they're already being erased. Life went on in the way people promise it will when they're trying to comfort you. Slowly at first, then all at once. Treatments worked. My body recovered enough to stop feeling like borrowed time. I married someone kind, someone patient, someone who believed me when I said some memories hurt more than others. I had children whose laughter filled rooms I once thought I'd never see again. I opened a small bookshop downtown, the kind with creaking floors and uneven shelves, a place that smelled like paper and dust and safety. From the outside, my life looked like proof that survival was worth it. People called me lucky. They said I was strong. I smiled when they said it, because smiling was easier than explaining that strength can feel a lot like drowning slowly with your eyes open. It took me years to notice Evan was disappearing. Not all at once, just in small, terrifying ways. I mentioned him in passing one evening, and my husband frowned gently, like I'd referenced a stranger. He didn't remember the name. Old photos lost their sharpness where Evan should have been, his face blurring until it looked like a smear of shadow between Lena and me. Hospital records that once haunted my filing cabinet vanished without explanation. Even Lena, when I finally asked her outright, shook her head and apologized for not knowing who I was talking about. I stopped asking after that. I learned to swallow his name before it reached my lips. Only I remembered him now, and the weight of that knowledge pressed harder every year, like my chest was being slowly compressed from the inside. The remembering became painful in ways I couldn't explain to anyone else. My head ached when I thought of him too long. Sometimes my nose bled. Sometimes I woke up gasping, convinced I'd been breathing fog in my sleep. Yet if I tried not to remember, if I pushed Evan away, the guilt hit even harder. It felt like betrayal layered on top of survival. I started going back to the cemetery alone, standing over the unmarked stone, whispering his name just to prove it still existed. That was when she returned. The moss woman looked worse than before, her skin cracked and sagging, patches missing like something had been feeding on her from the inside. Her dress hung heavier, darker, as if soaked in centuries of damp earth. She didn't bother pretending to be gentle anymore. She asked her question plainly, her voice dry and hollow. "Who else will you trade?" I understood then what she meant by cost. My life hadn't been free. It had been funded by forgetting. Every year I lived, someone else lost Evan a little more completely. The world balanced itself by taking from memory instead of flesh. The moss woman stepped closer, her breath cold against my face, and I realized she wasn't asking out of cruelty. She was asking because this was how things worked now. Survival required payment, and if I refused to offer anyone else, I would be the only one left holding a name that the rest of the world had already buried. Theo called me one night just after midnight, his voice tight and uncertain, like he was embarrassed by what he was about to say. He told me he'd been having the same dream for weeks. In it, he was standing knee-deep in dark water that smelled like rot, surrounded by trees with roots like twisted fingers. There was fog everywhere, thick, greenish fog that pressed against his skin and crawled into his lungs. He said he always woke up just before something reached him from beneath the surface. I tried to laugh it off at first, told him nightmares run in families. Then he said a name, Evan. He didn't know why he said it, only that it felt important, like the word was being pulled out of him. My hands started shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. Theo had never met Evan. He shouldn't have known that name at all. Over the next few days, things got worse. Theo began noticing fog where it didn't belong curling along the riverbank near his apartment, drifting through parking lots on clear nights. Once he swore he saw footprints appear in wet concrete with no one around to make them. He asked me if I remembered Evan, asked why thinking about him made his chest ache. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. Because in that moment, I understood what the moss woman had meant. Theo wasn't just dreaming, he was remembering. Somehow, impossibly, Evan's name had found another anchor. That made Theo the second rememberer. And I knew what that meant. The second, the street light outside my window flickered green. The curse didn't linger passively, it hunted. Memory was a signal, and Theo had just lit himself up in the dark. I started seeing her everywhere after that. The moss woman stood at bus stops, in reflections at the edge of crowds where no one else seemed to notice her. She looked more decayed each time, pieces of her flaking away, as if she were rotting in reverse. Green fog followed her like a shadow. It seeped under doors, hovered over water, clung to Theo whenever I was near him. I watched him grow paler, more distracted, the same way Evan had toward the end. Every instinct in me screamed to protect him, to pull him away from whatever was circling closer. But the rules were already set. Remembering attracted the curse. The more Theo thought about Evan, the tighter the fog wrapped around him. The moss woman didn't speak to me at first. She didn't have to. Her presence alone was a countdown. The choice she offered when she finally spoke was quieter than I expected. Save him, she said, or let him forget. Those were the only options. If Theo forgot Evan completely, the fog would recede, the dreams would stop, and he'd go on living without ever knowing what brushed past him in the dark. But if I tried to make him remember, if I told him the truth, shared the weight I'd been carrying for years, then I would lose Evan myself. His name would vanish from my mind, taken to balance the scales. I lay awake for nights afterward, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing. Saving Theo meant erasing the last piece of Evan that still existed. Letting Theo remember meant risking his life. That was when I understood the true cruelty of the bargain. The curse didn't force you to choose between good and evil. It forced you to choose which love you were willing to bury. I didn't tell Theo what I was planning. Some truths are too dangerous to share, and some journeys have to be taken alone. The swamp lay beyond the edge of town, past roads no one used anymore, where the land dipped low and the air stayed damp even in winter. The closer I got, the heavier my chest felt, as if every breath carried a name I'd forgotten to mourn. Green fog drifted between the trees, thin at first, then thick enough to mute sound. When my boots sank into black water, I knew I was in the place the moss woman had been guarding all along. The swamp felt old, in a way that went beyond age, like it had been waiting centuries for someone to finally look at it and understand what it held. The fog parted without warning, and the world shifted. I wasn't alone anymore. I saw a woman running through the trees, her dress clean, her hair loose, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was young and sick, coughing into her sleeve, blood blooming like a secret she couldn't hide. I knew her name before anyone spoke it. Elspeth Moore. She called out for someone who never answered. A husband, a brother, anyone. When she collapsed at the edge of the water, something answered her instead. It rose from the mud like a shadow with weight. Small but wrong, with eyes too dark to reflect light. It spoke to her grief, not her ears. It promised she wouldn't be alone. It promised survival. All it asked in return was memory. I watched as it bound itself to her, slipping into her like a thought she couldn't get rid of. The curse formed there, in that moment of desperation. Two memories were required to anchor a soul. The creature explained, not out of kindness, but necessity. One memory to hold the dead in place, another to feed what lingered. Forgotten names were its sustenance. Each time a person was erased, it grew stronger. Elspeth lived when she should have died, but she lived wrong. Centuries passed, and the woman became the moss woman, her body changing, rotting, sustaining itself on what the creature needed. Eventually, even her own name was taken from her. Elspeth forgot who she had been, forgot why she wandered, forgot that she was more than a vessel. When the vision faded, I was back in the swamp, shaking, soaked to the knees. The moss woman stood across the water, watching me with something that looked almost like sorrow. She wasn't the monster I'd imagined all these years. She was the evidence of a bargain made by someone who didn't want to die alone. The true horror wasn't her. It was the system that fed on forgetting, the way grief could be harvested and turned into currency. I understood then that Evan, Theo, and I were all part of the same pattern. Memory wasn't just power, it was food, and somewhere deep in that swamp, something was still hungry. Theo stepped out of the fog like he'd been there all along. At first, relief hit me so hard my knees nearly buckled. He looked dry, unharmed, his jacket zipped the way it always was when he forgot gloves. He called my name in that familiar, annoyed way, like I'd dragged him somewhere stupid again. I took one step toward him and stopped. His shadow didn't match his body. It lagged behind, stretching in the wrong direction, twitching when he stood still. When he smiled, the skin around his mouth pulled too far, splitting at the corners with a wet sound. His face trembled, then cracked down the middle like soft clay, tearing apart. Two mouths spoke at once, overlapping, repeating things he'd never say, things meant to hurt. He told me it was my fault, that I should have died instead, that remembering was just another way of being selfish. The swamp filled with voices after that. My husband stood waist deep in water, his skin sagging from his bones as he spoke gently about how tired he was of carrying me. Lena appeared next, her eyes clouded white, apologizing for forgetting someone she insisted never mattered. Even my children surfaced in the fog, their faces aging and rotting as they asked why I was always sad. Each figure decayed as it spoke, flesh slowing away, words bubbling through collapsing throats. The air pressed in, thick and suffocating, forcing its way into my mouth, my nose, my lungs. I felt something moving inside the fog, coiling closer, searching for an opening. The pressure in my head built until I thought my skull might split. I understood then that the entity didn't just want memory. It wanted me, a living vessel that already knew how to survive carrying the dead. I dropped to my knees, choking, hands clawing at my chest. Panic rose fast, sharp, familiar. And then, unexpectedly, I laughed. It came out broken and hoarse at first, then stronger. The sound startled even me. I laughed because the faces were wrong, because Theo never sounded that cruel, because Evan had never been those hospital screams alone. I laughed because I remembered Evan the way he actually was barefoot in the summer, terrible at keeping secrets, laughing so hard he snorted when he thought something was really funny. I remembered the way he talked with his hands, the way he loved bad jokes and loud music, the way he rolled his eyes at anything overly dramatic. He wasn't haze, he wasn't rot. He was alive, once, fully and imperfectly, and that mattered more than how he died. The fog recoiled as the laughter grew steadier. The false faces began to glitch, flickering, their features melting back into shapeless mist. Theo's split face trembled, then smoothed, confusion replacing malice before he dissolved entirely. The pressure eased, the green haze thinned, pulling back toward the water like a tide reversing itself. I stayed on my knees, breathing hard, repeating Evan's name, not as a plea, not as a bargain, but as a memory, anchored in joy instead of fear. The swamp grew quieter. Somewhere deep within it, something hissed in frustration. For the first time since this began, I felt it weaken, and I knew then that anger wasn't what starved it. Love was. The swamp went unnaturally still after the fog pulled back, like it was holding its breath. Across the water, the moss woman stood hunched and trembling, her shape flickering between solid and dissolving mist. For the first time I saw fear in her posture, not directed at me, but inward, like something inside her had begun to wake up. My head throbbed as fragments of the vision I'd seen earlier returned with painful clarity. The woman coughing blood into her sleeve, the whispered bargain, the creature feeding on what was forgotten. A name pressed against the inside of my skull, heavy and insistent, like it had been waiting years to be spoken aloud. I understood then what forgetting had done. The curse didn't begin with malice. It began when a woman lost everything, including herself. The world had erased her, and something else had stepped in to claim what was left. I wasn't standing before a monster. I was standing before someone who had been forgotten so completely that forgetting became her prison. I stepped closer to the water, my boots sinking into the mud. The moss woman raised her head slowly, her hair peeling back from her face in strands. Beneath it was skin mottled and cracked, eyes dull with exhaustion rather than rage. My voice shook when I spoke, but I didn't stop. I said her name, Elspeth Moore. The sound of it rippled across the swamp like a stone thrown into still water. The air screamed. The fog convulsed, twisting violently as something inside her writhed. A black, oily shape tore free from her chest, with a sound like ripping fabric, shrieking as it hit the water and dissolved into nothing. Elspeth collapsed forward, gasping, her body rapidly changing color returning, cracks sealing, the rot falling away like a shed skin. She looked human again, fragile, alive. When she met my eyes, she smiled weakly, as if remembering herself for the first time in centuries. The swamp brightened, the green haze fading into pale white mist. That's when Evan appeared. He stepped out from between the trees, whole and solid, the way he looked before sickness ever touched him. His smile was easy, familiar, real. No distortion, no repetition, just him. I couldn't speak. Tears blurred everything as he crossed the shallow water without disturbing it, and stood in front of me. He didn't reach out. He just looked at me with that same soft patience he'd always had. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't echo. It didn't carry warning or fear. He thanked me not for remembering him, but for letting him go. He told me that memory isn't meant to be a cage, and that love doesn't disappear just because names fade. He said he wasn't afraid anymore, that he hadn't been for a while. As he stepped back, his shape softened into light instead of fog, dissolving gently into the air like breath on a cold morning. Elspeth watched him go, tears streaking down her face, whispering apologies to no one and everyone all at once. The swamp returned to silence, empty and ordinary, as if it had never held anything at all. When I turned away, my chest ached, but it was a clean ache, sharp and honest. I knew Evan's name would eventually leave me too, and for the first time, I understood that was okay. Some endings aren't losses, they're releases. Life didn't crash back into place the way I expected it to. It returned quietly, like a tide slipping in while you're not looking. Days passed, then weeks. The fog never came back. Theo stopped dreaming of swamps and started complaining about ordinary things. Again, work, traffic, the weather. I didn't tell him where I'd gone or what I'd done. I didn't need to. He remembered Evan now, casually, naturally, the way people remember childhood friends without pain. One afternoon he laughed and told a story about a boy who used to sneak candy into movie theaters with us, and it took me a moment to realize who he meant. My chest tightened, but the panic didn't follow. Something had shifted, and whatever had been circling us had finally moved on. I noticed the change in smaller places too. At home, while cleaning, I found an old photo album I hadn't opened in years. It was heavy in my hands, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Inside were photos I didn't remember taking. 3 kids at the lake, arms slung over each other, sunburned and grinning. Evan was there, clear, solid, his face sharp, his smile unmistakable. My husband leaned over my shoulder and smiled, telling me a story about Evan like it was the most natural thing in the world. No confusion, no hesitation. The name sat easily on his tongue. I nodded along, smiling back, relieved and unsettled all at once. This was what I'd wanted, wasn't it? Proof that Evan had existed. Proof that he hadn't been erased. And yet something about the photos felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's past. Over time, people mentioned Evan more often. Lena sent me a message apologizing for losing touch after everything we went through together. My children asked questions about him, curious and warm, filling in a space that had once been hollow. Each time his name came up, I felt a strange calm instead of grief. No sharp ache, no familiar sting behind my eyes, just a soft, neutral understanding. It wasn't until one evening, standing alone in my bookshop after closing, that I realized what was missing. I tried to picture Evan the way I always had his laugh, the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, the exact sound of his voice when he said my name. The image slipped away from me, not suddenly, gently, like a word on the tip of my tongue that refuses to come back. Panic flickered, brief and distant, then faded before it could take hold. I stood there for a long time, surrounded by shelves of stories other people had remembered long enough to write down. I understood then that the bargain had completed itself. Evan was remembered by the world now, safely, fully. He no longer needed me to hold him in place. The weight I'd carried for so long was gone, and in its absence was something quieter. Peace, maybe, or rest. It didn't feel like loss, the way I'd always feared it would. It felt like setting something down after holding it for too long, your arms aching but relieved. I locked up the shop and stepped outside into the cool night air, breathing easily, freely, without fog pressing in from the edges. As I walked home, one thought surfaced, clear and steady, carrying no pain at all. The dead don't leave when they're buried. They leave when someone else remembers them instead.